Hello friends, we're back with another episode of the Spookcast. Hello. I hope you're doing well and the spooks haven't been getting to you too much this week. I am pleased with the engagement on the podcast so far. It's actually better than I thought it was going to be. I was like, oh my god, who would actually want to listen to me yap for over 60 minutes? But hey, you guys are really cool and supportive and it makes me feel very happy. So thank you for that. So I'll get right into it. We had a topic pool for the Spook of the Week segment early this week on Patreon, as we do every week, by the way. If you want to also recommend topics, then please join the Patreon, or if you can't afford it, just send me an email. I'll put the link in the description and I will add it to the topics pool. Anyway, so in this Spook of the Week topic request pool, we found one that people seem to be interested in because I put it out as a poll and people voted on it, and the Spook Council has spoken. Okay, so this week we will be discussing and then later theoretically dissecting, drumroll, the global rise of the far right with regards to what I want to call the citizenship spook. So this has become an increasingly pivotal issue in global political discourse, especially with the rise of the far right and all the ideologies that come from that. So how does this all tie into current events? Let's think about that first. So I thought the best way that I could kind of break it down would be to go through a few stories from last week specifically that I found that relate to citizenship in general, and then to think on the evolving shifts in citizenship policies and attitudes and what they mean in the larger context of like nationalism, immigration, and identity politics. First up, we have an article that I found on a website called visaguide.world that discusses the Trump administration's decision to freeze the processing of immigration applications for migrants from Ukraine and Latin America. This freeze specifically targets programs like Uniting for Ukraine, or U4U, and Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, or CHNV, which are all aimed at granting temporary protection to migrants. This move comes after allegations of fraud and national security risks tied to these programs, which resulted in an indefinite freeze on applications. Obviously, this action speaks volumes about how citizenship is being treated not as a right, but as a privilege granted or withheld at the whim of the state. So it's a direct manifestation of this citizenship spook, which I'm going to be discussing, where the idea of national belonging is tightly bound to notions of security, fraud, prevention, and cultural purity, right? So these are like the core tenets of far-right rhetoric. Citizenship, which I guess once kind of was supposed to be an inclusive concept, is now, through this rhetoric, weaponized to create an us versus them narrative. And for those migrants already in the US, the prospect of deportation or the revocation of parole status presents a pretty dark reality of how fragile one's belonging actually is, right? So this reflects a broader trend where the far-right rhetoric that underpins nationalism, security, and the policing of citizenship has become mainstream. So the idea of who belongs and who doesn't is shifting, and it often hinges on factors the far right deems like undesirable or, other in general, which all ties back to this spook of citizenship. Okay, then I found an article from a website called IamExpat.de. So it's a German website that discusses the increasing number of Americans that are renouncing their citizenship, which is interesting in my opinion. This is primarily motivated by the burdensome US tax obligations that require expatriates to file taxes on worldwide income, even if they are taxed in another country. So this issue disproportionately affects accidental Americans, quote unquote, or individuals born in the US or with US parentage, but who have lived most of their lives abroad. So this trend of renunciation is notable with 3,000 to 6,000 Americans giving up their citizenship annually since 2013. And this scenario brings us to a kind of critical reflection on the citizenship spook from another perspective. So here, citizenship is no longer just a matter of identity. It's increasingly tied to economic obligations and bureaucratic demands. So the concept of citizenship, which once was, again, supposed to be like a fundamental marker of belonging, is now being commodified. Right? So people are giving up their ties to the state because they no longer feel it offers them anything of value except burdens. And I would say from a Stirnerian perspective, this is an expression of the ego asserting its independence and rejecting the spook of national identity. But we're going to discuss that more later on. I guess what this trend signifies about the changing relationship between citizens and the state, to me, is that it could be seen as a challenge to traditional notions of citizenship as a permanent, inalienable bond. So citizenship is becoming more transactional, and it's shaped by individual self-interest and the calculus of benefits versus costs. So I don't know, I thought that was an interesting little article and development. Then there was another article that I found in The Guardian that discussed how Central American countries like Panama and Costa Rica are being coerced into accepting deported migrants as part of U.S. immigration policy. So the U.S. has leveraged its geopolitical influence by using threats of tariffs and pulling out of treaties and the Panama Canal Agreement to force these countries into compliance, right? So as a result, thousands of migrants from Asia, the Middle East, and other regions are being sent to these countries and are often kind of placed in what is referred to in the article as like a legal limbo with very little support or hope for the future. So to me, this highlights the role of citizenship as a tool of global power. The sovereignty of these Central American states is essentially undermined as they become complicit in the U.S.'s increasingly problematic immigration policies. So this quote-unquote global policing of borders by powerful states reinforces the citizenship spook, and it shows how national identity and belonging are governed by power dynamics that prioritize the interests of the few over the rights of the many. I also think that this scenario is an example of how far-right immigration policies are not just national, but they are very much actually transnational. So they influence global migration patterns and they reshape notions of belonging and exclusion on a worldwide scale. Okay, then I found some other interesting news that relates to citizenship. Maybe it's not the kind that you would expect, but I found an article by CNN that reports that the tiny nation of Nauru is selling its citizenship for $105,000 to fund climate resilience initiatives. So Nauru faces existential threats from climate change, apparently, and the funds generated from selling citizenships are supposed to safeguard the population. So this concept is actually quite controversial. It's referred to as golden passports, but it also illustrates how citizenship has become something that is very much bought and sold. So the sale of citizenship in Nauru points to the ways in which citizenship is becoming increasingly detached from stuff like national identity and much more aligned with economic utility. I thought this was sort of interesting. So to me, this reflects a broader trend where smaller nations are being forced to commodify their citizenship to survive essentially in this changing world. So in the context of global nationalism, this could also be seen as a response to the inequities of climate change, a phenomenon that, disproportionately affects less developed nations, while the wealthier, industrialized ones continue to control the resources. And finally, let's bring in some celebrity news, pop culture news too, because why not? It's relevant. Jesse Eisenberg apparently now has been offered Polish citizenship for his movie efforts, I guess. This story kind of offers a more maybe personal and cultural angle on citizenship. So this was given to him in recognition of his work on a film about his family's Holocaust history. His story of reclaiming his cultural roots very much contrasts with the increasingly exclusionary and nationalist movements we see today. So Eisenberg's experience highlights, in my opinion, that citizenship isn't always about legal status or the political landscape either. So it's also about belonging, identity, and cultural connection when you look at it from that cultural perspective. So the idea of reclaiming or reconnecting with a homeland, as this movie was about. I didn't watch it, but that's essentially what it's about, as far as I understand. So this kind of serves as a reminder that the citizenship spook in the minds of people is very much alive, and it also shows an interesting, I think, tension when it comes to celebrity, because there are people who are forced to leave their homes, while others like Eisenberg are just like sort of trivially able to return because they're linked to, I don't know, some historical narrative of belonging that is essentially rooted in his celebrity status in this specific example. So these are the articles that I had time to read, that I was able to find. And gathering from these articles, I would say that we have the following key aspects that relate to citizenship. So we have citizenship being used by the state to construct and enforce identity boundaries. Then we also see the issue of personal freedom as people contest national identity. Then we have the commodification of citizenship from the island of Nauru and Jesse Eisenberg's emotional connection to Polish heritage, as well as what feels to me like kind of a trivialization, which is tied to the concept of celebrity. So when we apply a Stirnerian lens to all of this, I think we can see a spook of citizenship, as I have stated many times in this particular part of the podcast. So we can see that citizenship is used as a tool by states, global powers, and even individuals to sort of construct and enforce identity. And Stirner would probably argue that these are ultimately meaningless and spooky as hell, or in terms of their relationship to what could be perceived as genuine personal freedom. So citizenship becomes a spook that dictates who belongs and who doesn't. It's used for control movements, secure national borders, blah, 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 and for artificial divisions. And it's used now as economic utility. And how does all of this relate to the rise of the far right? Well, as I have said already, the far right relies on the exclusionary power of citizenship to create a strict and hierarchical vision of national identity. So by reinforcing borders and emphasizing cultural and ethnic purity, as they do, far right ideologies kind of treat citizenship not as a shared right, but more like a privilege that's like bestowed only upon those deemed quote unquote worthy of the citizenship. So this focus on securing national belonging at the cost of others mirrors this artificial division, which I think Stirner critiqued. So the far right's use of citizenship as a tool of control through the concept of identity very much aligns with Stirner's analysis of how societal constructs shape and limit the individual. So basically, the far right, through its nationalist and exclusionary policies and discourse and, rhetoric, exploits the citizenship spook to establish a divisive and limiting identity that traps both the state and its citizens in cycles of division and exclusion. So let's look more into all of this in the next segment and actually dissect this spook. Alright, so what did Stirner say about citizenship in his work? So there are various segments that allude to it in The Ego and Its Own. I want to just kind of talk about the angle that he takes. So Stirner addresses the concept of citizens or citizenship through a broader critique of fixed ideas, obviously, and this idea of fanaticism. So he uses the term citizen as an example of individuals who are, quote unquote, possessed by societal ideals. And this is kind of presented as similar or basically the same as any kind of religious or moral conviction. So Stirner argues that just as someone can be enslaved by faith or religious dogma, a citizen is enslaved by the idea of the state and morality and national identity. So according to Stirner, the citizen has a fixed idea of their identity. And their identity is that of a loyal person and a responsible member of society. So this idea is what dominates their life and their choice to consider themselves a citizen, much like a madman would be dominated by their delusions. That's how it's represented in the text. So Stirner points out the hypocrisy and fanaticism of this idea, right? So whether someone follows the faith of the state is no different than the faith of citizenship. So for Stirner, these ideas of a good citizen, is irrational. And it's actually hiding something much deeper. So the citizen isn't free, even though the citizen is told through this new concept of the nation state. So he talks about how there's a new idea of the nation state, which is like sort of thought up by the bourgeoisie. We no longer have a direct monarch or the estates, as he called it. Now we have the state. Okay, the state, which is supposed to make people freer, but it actually doesn't. It actually kind of obscures a lot of the more direct and overt power mechanisms that were in place before. So the citizen is not free. The citizen is actually a slave to the state or the state's moral authority. So Stirner's critique of citizenship in his text isn't necessarily about political systems or legal structures. It's more about the psychological conditioning of citizens, of individuals to become citizens. So the individual internalizes these social roles to the extent that they become an unshakable part of their identity, right? This is the same with any other fixed idea. So in this context, Stirner challenges the idea of citizenship by arguing that the individual is being held down or tied down by the state or by an external ideal, and it's no different than it's ever been before, and he explains why he thinks so. So first, he explains that there was a shift from estates to the nation state. So he begins by describing the transition from the feudal system of estates like guilds and nobility and clergy to what is called the nation state. So he explains that the third estate, the bourgeoisie, revolutionized this structure by abolishing the distinction between estates and establishing the nation as a single overarching identity. So he says in a quote the following: "The third estate decided no longer to be and be called an estate beside other estates, but to glorify and generalize itself into the nation." So he explains that this shift led to the formation of a new kind of monarchy, where the state becomes the sole estate, and the individual's identity is subsumed within the broader notion of citizenship. Okay, so in this sense, the citizen is a servant of the state. Okay, so Stirner argues that citizenship doesn't liberate the individual as it is presented to people, and that it actually subjects them to the authority of what is now the nation state and turns them into like implicit servants who have to obey its laws. And he very much criticizes the bourgeoisie for promoting this view of freedom. He says in a quote, "The obedient servant is the free man. What glaring nonsense. Yet this is the sense of the bourgeoisie. So in Stirner's view, the citizen is free only in the sense that they are free from the direct rule of a person, right? Like the monarch, but they're still bound to a higher power, therefore they're not free. Okay, just because now the state is telling you that you're free doesn't mean that you're free. Okay, so this freedom is a gigantic brainfuck illusion because the individual is still subject to the state's laws and moral principles and general dictates, okay? The next point that he makes is about political and religious liberty, which is actually subjugation. So Stirner critiques the liberal notion of political liberty, which he sees as a form of subjugation. So in the liberal state, this is what he claims, political liberty means the individual's subjection to the state's laws, but with the illusion of freedom from personal authority. So he says, quote, political liberty means that the polis, the state, is free, not that I am free from the state. So he actually parallels this with the religious liberty of Protestantism, which involves the individual having a direct relationship with God, okay, and thereby bypassing the mediation of the priests. So similarly, in political liberty, what is promoted is that the individual's relation to the state is more direct, but it's actually more of a subjugation in a sense, because it's an implicit mindfuck subjugation. Another point that he makes is that there is something like a citizenship of service. So he mocks the idea that individuals are free through service to the state. So in the bourgeoisie view, one becomes free by fulfilling one's duties to the state, just like an obedient servant is seen as free. Okay, so he says in this quote, he who serves the cause, devotes himself entirely to it, has the true freedom. That is, of course, meant ironically. So the state, and by extension its laws and values, become the cause that the citizen serves. And this mentality leads individuals to view their subjugation to the state as an act of freedom and virtue. Then another point that he makes is that there is an illusion regarding what is considered rational order. So in liberalism, according to Stirner, there's a rational order that subordinates individual will to the collective will of the state or society. So this rational order claims to bring freedom and justice. It kind of acts like you're all involved now. You're all part of it. You're all deciding. You're all creating this society. But he claims that it actually enslaves the individual by determining what is rational and lawful. And this is something that's problematic because it takes the individual away from their self-ownership. He says in a quote, liberalism is nothing else than the knowledge of reason applied to our existing relations. So he criticizes the approach of liberalism to reduce human agency to obedience or reason or law, and not allowing self-determination or expression of the individual. Then there's another point that he makes, which is kind of putting all of that into one big argument, which is that citizenship essentially is deceptive freedom. Okay, so he views citizenship as a deceptive form of freedom. So while the modern citizen may be freed from the personal rule of a monarch, they are not free because they are now subject to the impersonal authority, the implicit brainwash authority of the state and its laws. So in this quote, he says, the liberty of the commonality is liberty or independence from the will of another person. But one has become so much the more submissive to the law. So the individual is still governed, but the form of governance has shifted from personal rule to legal and much more difficult to kind of determine and see and understand bureaucratic systems. And this is, if you want to think about it, this is kind of what Elon Musk is doing right now. He's acting like he's trying to free people from bureaucratic systems when this is like next level, like it's next level fucking bullshit. So, all right. So Stirner critiques citizenship as a form of subjugation to the state, and he describes the transition to modern citizenship as a shift from multiple monarchies to a single absolute monarchy, which he feels is more difficult to kind of understand. It's a kind of Kafkaesque situation we got going on here. So this is the nation state. So citizenship is far from being liberating, and it results in individuals serving the state and giving up their personal autonomy for the sake of a rational order that is ultimately a form of enslavement. So I want to look deeper into this, and I want to go into psychoanalysis and a little bit of critical theory, because like I said, a lot of this shift from the estates to the nation state is kind of like fueled by this like sophistication when it comes to understanding the psyche. So first I want to look at Freud's work in Civilization and its Discontents, because it actually offers a pretty valuable perspective here on the development of civilization and the psychological repression that comes with it. So Freud argues that civilization necessitates the suppression of certain desires to maintain social order. And in his view, the individual has to give up a degree of their instinctual desires in order to function within society. This is what he calls sublimation. And this repression, or this form of repression, leads to a sense of discontent in the individual. And obviously Stirner's critique of citizenship, or critique of spooks in general, parallels this, because here citizenship, in the sense that Stirner critiques it, involves the individual's subjugation to the law, which mirrors Freud's assertion that civilization is built upon the repression of instinctual drives. So just as Freud argues that civilization requires individuals to subdue their desires for the sake of social harmony, Stirner sees citizenship as the suppression of the individual's will to serve the interests of the state. So Freud's idea of the superego is relevant here. So the superego is the internalized moral authority that governs individual behavior, and this obviously can be related to Stirner's spooks, because these are internalized beliefs and values that control the individual's actions, and this is kind of what Stirner accuses the state of kind of taking advantage of in individuals. So the citizen is the individual whose inner world is dominated by the internalized superego of the state and society. And to look a little bit more into that, I want to look at my imaginary bestie, Jacques Lacan, who talks about the mirror stage. So the mirror stage is where the I, the quote-unquote I, not the I like the things in our face, but the I is formed in relation to the other, okay? So this idea can be applied to citizenship through the concept of identity formation. So according to Lacan, the I, or I guess ego, if we're looking at it in a more Stirnerian way, is formed through the recognition of oneself in the mirror. So the child at a certain age looks in the mirror and they're like, oh, that's me. That's not someone else. Therefore, if that's me, I have to project what I see onto something external and externalize myself in a sense, and externalize other as well. So there's a separation that happens in this mirror stage from the self and the other. So this is like the birth of what Freud would call the superego, what Lacan calls the symbolic order, and so forth. So Lacan's notion of the other, so the societal, cultural, or symbolic order that shapes identity, resonates with Stirner's concept of spooks, because citizenship, in this sense, is a process by which the individual identifies with the state as a large social order and internalizes the state's laws and expectations and moral codes and so forth. So the citizen is an individual who has internalized the role of the quote-unquote good subject of the state and finds freedom in that, and recognizes themselves as a member of the national body. So this identification with the state mirrors Lacan's description of how the ego forms in relation to the symbolic order, where individuals are sort of guilty of identifying with the norms and values of the society they inhabit. So the individual's sense of self is actually distorted by the expectations of the state, just as the mirror image distorts the infant's sense of identity. Okay, now I want to look at Foucault's concept of governmentality, even though we kind of talked about that already last week, but I want to bring it in because it's still very much relevant here. So his concept of governmentality is another way to look at citizenship. So in his work, Discipline and Punish, Foucault discusses how power functions not just through overt control of individuals, but also through the more subtle mechanisms of discipline and surveillance. And these basically cause the individual to internalize social norms. So Foucault emphasizes how individuals become what he calls self-regulating subjects through the power of institutions like prisons or schools or family or whatever institution you can think of. So for Foucault, the state exerts power not just through laws, but through creating subjects who actually end up governing themselves. And that is kind of the power of the nation state, right? Convincing people that they are free in self-governance. So this is particularly relevant when considering Stirner's critique of the nation state, because the modern citizen isn't simply coerced by external authority. They internalize the rules of the state and they regulate their own behavior according to these norms. Think of Foucault's concept of the panopticon, which kind of has this like implicit like, big brother, I'm watching you, but you don't really know if you're actually being watched. You just kind of make sure that you don't act out of place in case somebody's watching, if you know what I mean. So yeah, in Stirner's terms, the spooks of citizenships are those external forces that become internalized and produce a subject who sees themselves as free only within the narrow bounds set by the state. Then another way that I want to look at it as well is Giorgio Agamben's concept of homo sacer. I think that's how you say it, sacer. Sorry if I said it wrong. But this concept basically defines a figure who is excluded from both the protection of the law and from society. So Agamben explores how the state exercises control over individuals by producing categories of what he calls bare life that are excluded from full citizenship, but that still remain subject to the state's authority. So the state can say that certain individuals exist outside of the law, like refugees, for example, while still asserting control over their lives. Also, Agamben's idea of the state of exception is very significant here. So in times of crisis, the state can suspend normal laws and create a situation where the state of law and the state of exception kind of merge. So this very much aligns with Stirner's critique, because in Agamben's analysis of the state of exception, we see that the state most definitely, like this proves that the state most definitely operates beyond the individual's freedom and the individual's control. Because the state, for both Stirner and Agamben, can treat individuals as what is called bare life, or citizens who are reduced to mere subjects of control without any genuine autonomy or agency in case of a crisis. So the critique of citizenship here extends to the idea that even those who are technically citizens are still subject to the capricious nature of state power, where their rights are contingent upon the state's recognition and they are not intrinsic to their freedom or their being. One more angle that I think is important is to look at culture, the cultural influence, which if you look at it through a critical theory perspective, you have to look at how ideology is often a form of diversion. Okay, so let's look at Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer's critiques. There's something that they call the culture industry, which according to Adorno and Horkheimer in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, the culture industry produces mass-produced cultural products that not only serve as entertainment, okay? Entertainment is never just entertainment. It also functions to maintain the status quo by shaping the desires and thoughts of individuals in a way that aligns with the capitalist needs. So there's a cultural manipulation that is very similar to Stirner's critique of how ideology shapes the individual, and this turns them into a citizen or a subject of the state. So the culture industry produces ideologies that bind individuals to the system, and it keeps them from questioning their own subjugation. So this is a lot like the modern citizen being a product of ideological forces that normalize the state and its laws, and this helps make resistance seem, unnecessary, right? So the citizen's identity, like the subject that is shaped by the culture industry, is mediated by external forces that dictate their behavior. And this, of course, leaves very little room for any kind of self-determination. Okay, to wrap it all up, Stirner's critique of citizenship as a spook exposes how this identity construct tied to the state and national belonging actually limits individual autonomy. So citizenship is not a form of empowerment. It's a tool of control, and it compels individuals to identify with and serve the state implicitly, and often at the expense of their true desires and self-interest. So far from being a universal right, citizenship is a condition that forces individuals into roles defined by external powers, whether that's the state or moral systems or collective identities. As we've seen in both global politics and the personal stories that I talked about earlier, from the exclusionary immigration policies in the US to the commodification of citizenship in Nauru and the renunciation of American citizenship by expatriates, citizenship is increasingly a matter of power, privilege, and control. So the far right's emphasis on strict and ethno-national borders reflects this same spook because it reinforces a rigid and exclusionary view of identity. But this is how I think it works. So what does the far right do? Like, what is the rhetoric? What are the tactics? This is what I found so far. So the rhetoric is that citizenship is a privilege. And if you are a citizen, by doing nothing other than being born somewhere and then carrying some favorable fucking heritage, then you are not only fine, but you are better than others who don't have that privilege. But this can easily be disproven, of course, by looking at Agamben's concept, because remember, if shit hits the fan, your supposed superiority does not mean shit, because technically they can still do whatever they want, and what they want is to protect the state. And maybe, according to the story about Americans giving up their citizenship, this is kind of a concept that is increasingly exposed as bullshit. Unfortunately, I think it's only exposed as such through identity politics in the media and such, which makes it a little bit more problematic because, becoming a citizen anywhere else isn't any better. But I don't know, maybe it means that people are waking up a little bit, who knows. Then the second main rhetoric, I would say, especially in America, in the far right, is that the state wants to rebuild the national collective sense of belonging by creating a safer environment, by basically no longer letting anyone else in and kicking out everyone who supposedly doesn't belong there. And of course, the way to critique that is to use Freudian Lacanian psychoanalysis, because ultimately there's no fucking way you can actually have a sense of belonging through supposed safety, because you're willingly ignoring the immense power of the state that is over your head. So because without giving up a part of your ownness and your sense of self and putting it in the hands of the state, there's no way you can be a member of a society. So if we listen to Freud, as he said, it will lead to discontentment. And this is exactly where the state comes in and says, hey, don't worry, sweet little baby citizen, just close your eyes, we got you, while sending massive amounts of people to be someone else's problem, So it's so clearly an egoistic endeavor to increase state power and keep you quiet. So the state will literally weaken international relations and put pressure on those relations to make its citizens feel safer, which they know is bullshit, even though weakening international relations makes it more vulnerable. So kind of Trump's ridiculous arrogance, for example, when it comes to, America's the greatest nation in the world and we'll be totally fine, you don't need to worry about it, go back to sleep. And leveraging its global power actually actually isn't producing safety for anyone, is it? And another way to look at it is, what is it all about? Well, what's anything ever about? It's about money, right? So citizenship is literally an economic currency, as can be seen with like the Nauru situation, for example, as well as Trump's constant babble about needing to save money and build a better economy for the American people. And let's not forget about the culture industry in the case of Jesse Eisenberg's story, teaching us all the importance of heritage and cultural belonging as something that we can use to, kind of convince ourselves that this is the right decision, even though it's coming from a totally different direction. All right, guys, this is about all I have for now on the topic. Let's head over to the next segment of the podcast, which is called Living Ownness. All right, friends, for the Living Ownness segment, I'm going to engage with a submission that I got, an email submission. By the way, you can also submit your most haunting spook experiences by using the link in the description. This one was by Asmodeus. So this was a very long submission, and I really would like to take my time to go through it. This was kind of actually a treasure trove of shit that I'm sure many of you can relate to, so I want to take my time to really get into what was said. So it seems, from what I could gather, that this person has confronted and kind of dismantled numerous spooks in their life. So there's friendship, authenticity, and the weight of societal expectations. And these experiences were kind of described to really reflect like an ongoing struggle of owning oneself in a world that's designed to mold individuals into fixed roles. One of the most striking revelations that were shared in this submission was about friendship. So this person once believed it to be, quote, the most important thing in my life, only to later kind of recognize that many of the so-called friendships were actually one-sided, and they kind of required constant effort on this person's part, while others remained passive. This realization kind of led to a redefinition of approach. So this person says, quote, friendships come and go. Sometimes they just fade away. Even on good terms, sometimes they end in conflict, and that's okay with me. So what we see here is a rejection of the spook of friendship, which somehow relates more to power and property than anything, in favor of something like an embrace of relationships as more fluid and impermanent and free from artificial obligations. So here's what I want to talk about in relation to this. You know that silly Buddhist inspired saying, if you love them, let them go? I want to talk about that whole letting go thing for a while and relate it to the difference between something like love and power, or relationships and property. So the Buddhist concept of letting go through a Stirnerian lens, I think, can help, because we can explore how these two seemingly disparate philosophies intersect when it comes to freedom, attachment, and ownership. So the Buddhist teaching often revolves around letting go of attachments, whether that's like people or material things or ideas. And the idea is to transcend suffering and embrace a more liberated existence. I mean, that sounds very similar to Stirner's egoism. But with Stirner's egoism, the focus is kind of shifted to something even more personal. And it kind of shows us how the prioritization of our own freedom actually leads to the embrace of the freedom of others, and therefore to more flexible and probably ultimately more fulfilling relationships that are more rooted in empathy rather than anything else. Stirner's philosophy is rooted in the idea that we as individuals are the ultimate arbiters of our own existence, and this is all free from the constraints of societal norms and values and ideals and whatever else demands our submission. So in this light, letting go isn't necessarily about renouncing attachments for a higher spiritual goal. It's more about realizing that attachment itself is a form of self-imposed constraint that actually limits our ability to fully experience and affirm our own freedom. So in Stirnerian terms, when we let go of things like the bullshit idea of relationships where someone owes you something and you owe something to them, we're not doing so out of self-sacrifice or for the benefit of others, but in order to assert our own freedom more fully. So in terms of how that relates to the freedom of others, is that when we think about letting go in the Buddhist sense, the common interpretation is that attachment leads to suffering. And the goal is to transcend that attachment to things, people, and ideas. So the Buddhist teaching suggests that attachment to any form, creates a sense of bondage, which prevents you from reaching enlightenment or inner peace. And at the core of this is the idea that freedom comes from the absence of attachment, so from detaching from the ego's need for ownership. Okay? So this is where Stirner's idea kind of flips everything on the head. So his notion of letting go isn't an act of self-sacrifice, but an act of empowerment through owning oneself. So according to Stirner, attachment, it's actually a political concept. The bonds that we form with others, the expectations that we have on relationships, and the ideals that we hold about friendships, they are all spooks in his terms. They are social constructs that limit us, that demand we behave according to society's rules and norms. And these constructs don't serve our ownness. So Stirner's egoism isn't about selfishness in the pejorative sense. It's about asserting freedom from these imposed obligations, including the obligation of friendship. So friendship, in this sense, is politicized through this philosophy. So to understand how Stirner's egoism reframes this letting go, let's look at the idea of relationships. So we think of relationships as things that we possess or exchanges of power, love, and attention. Okay, so Stirner would probably argue, though, that this possession of others, where we believe someone owes us loyalty, love, commitment, and all that, is itself a form of power that can inhibit freedom. Okay, so this doesn't mean abandoning relationships. It just means releasing the obligation to possess or control them. It's actually a rejection of the idea that a friendship or any relationship has to be permanent or fixed or transactional in the traditional sense. So instead, it's about letting people exist on their own terms and allowing those connections to be fluid and impermanent without the artificial weight of social expectations. And this kind of takes us to the point of where letting go can lead to more fulfilling relationships, as mentioned in this submission. So by shedding the burden of expectations, like, oh, you owe me and I owe you, we kind of allow people to exist as they are, not as we want them to be. And then we can appreciate that in each other, you know? Because when we truly prioritize our freedom, we automatically prioritize the freedom of others. And relationships therefore become about freedom, okay? They are no longer about property. They are about freedom. The only thing that you can own is yourself and what you do with yourself. So relationships are opportunities for empathy because both parties are free to shape the dynamic as they see fit, without fear of judgment, obligation, or the need for some kind of constant effort. So the idea here is that letting go in a Stirnerian sense isn't about losing something or sacrificing ourselves for others. It's actually about releasing your own spooks of obligation and ownership that kind of stifle your own freedom. So instead of thinking of it as like letting go of people, what you're actually doing is you're letting go of your own limitations, your own lack of freedom. So Asmodeus also talks about the illusion of emotional control, and that's the next thing I want to talk about. So what that means here is that there was a choice to express emotions that were deemed or considered or felt as problematic. So this person states that, quote, I always put on a facade around others so I wouldn't be vulnerable and to hide my true self. And this very much echoes the broader societal tendency to idealize emotional repression as a form of strength. And let's think back to psychoanalysis here. So I would claim that Stirner would reject this as an imposed ideal, and even more than that, a moralistic framework that is designed to actually stifle individuality. So this is interesting because Stirner's often like aestheticized, especially in meme culture, as this like hyper arrogant, hyper I don't give a fuck, I'm too cool for school type of person. And I want to use this opportunity to tie in a critique of this representation, because I feel like Stirner was much more supportive of the idea of just like free flowing emotion. Okay, so, and maybe this kind of ties in with our later discussion of masculinity as well. So let's connect this with a common meme representation of Stirner in contemporary culture, which is the Chad Stirner meme, right? So this image portrays Stirner as this, person that I just explained, and it kind of distills Stirner's egoism into like a caricature of like a hyper masculine, emotionless and aloof figure who supposedly rejects all societal norms and just like generally doesn't give a fuck, And it's tempting to kind of romanticize Stirner in this way. There's a lot of like edits on TikTok where it's like representing him in that way, but I feel like this version of him is so fucking misleading. So I'm just gonna make the argument that Stirner's philosophy is not about detachment in the sense of emotional suppression or like Machiavellianism or something like that. It's actually more about owning yourself fully, which means to embrace your true desires and emotions without letting any external ideals dictate how you should feel or express yourself. So the meme version of Stirner represents him as someone who doesn't care, which just isn't true. Because just because he rejects spooks of societal pressure doesn't mean that he's rejecting his own desires and emotions. Being like the cool Chad type guy is itself a spook, right? So Stirner's philosophy is actually about recognizing that we don't need to suppress parts of ourselves for approval or to fit into predefined roles. So Stirner would probably argue that the Chad Stirner meme, in its oversimplification, is obviously a spook. So it represents a false ideal of what it means to be a truly free individual, which in that case is something that strips away the complexity of human emotions and desires. So a person can be fully themselves, emotionally, vulnerably, and authentically, without needing to conform to any prescribed image of what strength or individually looks like. So the living ownness of Stirner, the living ownness that Stirner advocates for, is not about suppressing or rejecting emotions. It's about expressing them freely and without shame, totally unburdened by the need to appear cool or in control or anything like that. I mean, to be honest, we could go into patriarchy here, but I will leave that for another day. And not to be all Buddhist today, but I want to go back to Buddhism for the idea of emotional control one more time, because it's an interesting concept in Buddhism. So Buddhism teaches that emotional control isn't about suppression or repression of feelings, but about cultivating a space where emotions can be observed, right? So this is like observing emotions without becoming entangled in them. So it's not about feeling, okay? It's about learning to witness emotions as they arise and acknowledging them and then letting them pass without being carried away by them. So this is what I'm trying to say about Stirner. Emotional control in this context is not about pushing emotions down or rejecting them. It's about owning them. And there's a big difference. Okay, Stirner would probably reject the societal pressure to hide or suppress emotions as a form of strength. So the idea that emotional repression is somehow a mark of self-control is obviously a spook. I would say that the strength that Stirner talks about is the freedom to be yourself, to be emotionally authentic without fear of judgment or need to appear in control. So the Buddhist practice of watching emotions pass is crucial here. So in Buddhism, the focus isn't on fighting or denying feelings, it's on observing them and allowing them to come and go without clinging to them at all. This is acceptance, right? It's not detachment. It's embracing emotions fully without becoming identified with them. And that's kind of the key. So when we bring this back to Stirner, we can see how his philosophy can complement this, right? Stirner doesn't advocate for detaching from emotions or suppressing them in any sense. I would say that he would probably say that we have to own emotions, Okay, so this is kind of the same thing as saying observing them. So we own them. They belong to us. And in the same sense, other people's emotions belong to them. Therefore, those things can't get so easily entangled. So ultimately, this understanding of emotional control within Stirnerian and Buddhist frameworks points to like a deeper and more liberated form of emotional freedom than could sort of superficially be represented in this like Chad, like controlling your emotions type meme. And I think this is important to always kind of look out for the difference, because therefore you're kind of looking out for the spook. Like you're kind of like, am I being a little bit spooky right now? Or is this actually just me being, letting my emotions exist? Another spook that this person talks about is about absolute truth. So there's talks of a past of having been a devout atheist, and like blindly arguing for scientific truth without actually understanding epistemology. And I'm gonna quote this person here saying, quote, "I was ignorant as fuck and truth came to haunt me." So the fixation on universal truth is fucking dangerous in my opinion, because it often leads to really fucking rigid dogmatism. So I want to talk about that. And actually, this person confesses that, quote, "I will probably take a job just to meet the expectation of my dad, acquaintances, and my landlord, mostly so I don't have to deal with annoying questions like, how's the job search going?" And oh my God, this is something I can relate to, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. The interesting thing here to me is that it highlights a key challenge of egoism in practice, which is navigating external pressures while staying true to one's own desires. So while Stirner would likely encourage rejecting imposed obligations, he probably also would recognize that strategic compromises sometimes are necessary for survival. But you have to ask yourself, is this necessary for your survival, or are you avoiding something? The key lies in knowing when external demands serve your ownness rather than actually undermining it. And this is so difficult, okay? And again, this relates to Stirner's concept of property. So in Stirnerian terms, property isn't just about material goods or possessions, it's about ownership of oneself, right? It's about the ability to claim and control what is mine. And that includes, of course, thoughts, beliefs, and experiences. So if truth is something external and imposed, then it's not mine, okay? It's an alien force that I have to submit to. But if truth, like any other form of knowledge or belief, is self-determined, then it becomes part of my ownness. It becomes my property, and it's something that I shape, that I control, and that I can discard if I want to. So this is why Stirner's egoism isn't about adhering to any particular ideology or truth. It's about discarding these external authorities and claiming ownership over our own beliefs, perspectives, and experiences. And this dynamic of balancing external pressures with inner desires is so difficult, because it's essentially what the entire concept of property in his philosophy is about. He wrote an entire book about it, so obviously it's complicated. So I'm just going to address you directly now. You're all welcome to listen, though. So I would say that the best way to go about these things that you've sort of presented is to really, really, really deeply think about the concepts of property and control, and to really reflect on what they mean to you personally. I think really thinking on your position and what you essentially want is the central issue here, because I think just from reading what you wrote, there might be some questions that are still open about that. And I think this idea of like putting on a mask to protect yourself, it's a good metaphor, or it's a good allegory for this, because it really makes you think about it. Like, why am I doing this? Why am I putting on this mask? Why don't I want the conflict? What is it that I want? Because you don't have to deal with these people's judgment. You don't have to. But I also understand not wanting to deal with the conflict, So in your case, it might be interesting to just really sit down and think about, what do I want? Maybe you just don't want conflict. Maybe you just are sick of conflict. Maybe you don't like conflict. And then that's something that you need to look at. So essentially, and I'm just going to be deeply honest here, the issue is what you want. So I believe that the best way to go about this would be to look at your desires for ownership and control. And I think that is where the question lies ultimately. So in regard to that, be honest with yourself and cut yourself some slack about having those desires, because they come from a place of lack. Okay, so something that you feel you need, which may be, just an idea, a need for harmony, okay, a need for lack of conflict. And this you will ultimately figure out once you make your own way through the fog and the confusion of discovering your freedom in really discovering your own desires. So to me, it seems like you might still be hiding and using the strategic, like, I'm putting on a mask thing as a rationale behind it. So I relate to this a lot, actually. I grew up in a family where putting your hands in your pockets for a second while hacking up wood when you're fucking 12 years old was seen as laziness. And all I wanted to do was run away from shit when I was a kid. All I wanted to do was sit down and just be, because there was always so much fucking judgment, you know, and not having to perform, not having to be judged all day long. And it took me a really long time before I was able to say, you know what, I don't need to hide from you anymore. Your judgment does not mean shit. And it was because I realized that these things that I had internalized were things that I personally didn't value. And I realized that the only reason he and the world, and ultimately anyone who does value emotional control and property, were the result of a feeling of lack. And it made me empathize with them. Not in the way of like accepting the shit they did to me, but in seeing them as subjects. And honestly, that really fucking helped me. So anyways, this shit is hard, but it's possible. And I'm sure if you're asking these questions, then you can fucking do it easily. I hope that helped. All right, let's move on to the next segment. And I'm very excited for this one. It's one of my favorite topics, actually. All right, in this segment, I want to talk about masculinity. And I want to do that by looking at an essay that was submitted to our e-zine, The Creative Nothing, by Onyx. All right, so let's first look at the structure of the essay. So the author starts with a personal anecdote, which kind of illustrates the societal reaction to gender norms. And then there's a pretty clear thesis statement, which is that masculinity is a harmful and controlling construction that should be eliminated, essentially. And this can be kind of analyzed and looked at through a Stirnerian lens of spooks and mixed with Banon's analysis of masculinity. All right, then in the second part, there's a definition of what is meant by spooks. So spooks are defined here as ideas, concepts that are treated as sacred and placed above the individual. So spooks are constructs that control and dominate an individual's behavior. Then there's an example of family that is used, which I think is really interesting here. So family is used here to illustrate how a concept can become a spook, right? The individual becomes bound to an idea of family that exerts influence even after the physical presence of family is gone. Then in the second part also, there's a distinction that's drawn between descriptive or neutral and prescriptive or controlling ideas. So spooks that function as prescriptive concepts that demand adherence and sacrifice individual autonomy. Then in part 3, we have the discussion of masculinity as a spook. So we have a look at Banon's view on masculinity. So Banon views masculinity as a cultural construct, which is composed of various masculinities that are shaped by factors like class, culture, and geography. And then we have a discussion of masculinity's origins. So in the text, it is explained as masculinity not being an innate thing, but being socially constructed and reinforced through various social factors, cultural factors like historical contexts and roles like family, school, media, and so forth. And then we have a discussion of hegemonic masculinity, so the dominant form of masculinity that is most culturally accepted and reinforced in specific times and places. Then in the fourth part, the author discusses the construction of masculinity, or spook making. So the cultural construction of masculinity is discussed here. So factors like class, ethnicity, geography, and historical context, like for example the Industrial Revolution, shape what is considered masculine. Then again, the author looks at hegemonic masculinity and defines masculinity as the successful way of being a man, which varies across cultures and societies. And then in part 5, we have the function of masculinity, or spook proving. So the author talks about the reinforcement of masculinity. So masculinity is socially reinforced, especially in childhood, and social agents like family, school, and media push boys to conform to gender roles and expectations, and therefore validate masculinity as sacred. Then there is a discussion of fragile masculinity, so the pressure to prove masculinity through actions like aggression and competitiveness. So masculinity becomes fragile as men feel the need to prove their adherence to these expectations. And then in this part, we also have a historical context that is offered to us, which explains masculinity's role in historical power dynamics, such as during the Industrial Revolution, where men were seen as rational, practical, and competitive due to their economic roles. And then we have a conclusion where masculinity is presented as a spook, and we have a call to action where the author argues for the elimination of masculinity and asserts that it's not a necessary part of human identity and that its elimination can free individuals from these restrictive roles that were explained before. Okay, now I want to kind of look into the key arguments that are presented in this text. So again, we have an analysis through a Stirnerian lens and a lens of John Boehnen's sociological analysis of masculinity. So the main arguments are as follows. So the first one is straight up, masculinity is a spook. And it's an ideological construct rather than a natural or necessary feature of human existence, as it is perceived as by so many people. So the author states, quote, "It is my view that masculinity is a controlling and harmful construction that should be eliminated as opposed to amended." All right, this argument is supported using Stirner's definition of spooks as ideas that people place above themselves. So the author states, quote, "Sacred is everything which for the egoist is to be unapproachable. Not to be touched, outside his power, above him. Sacred, in a word, is every matter of conscience." This is a quote by Stirner, used in the text. So masculinity as a socially enforced ideal operates in this way and demands adherence rather than allowing individual autonomy. So the next one is that masculinity is not fixed, but culturally constructed. So drawing from Boehnen, the text challenges the idea that masculinity is biologically determined in any sense. So the author uses a quote by Boehnen that reads as follows: "The widely held commonsensical assumption is that masculinity is a standardized container fixed by biology into which all normal men are placed. The author argues that instead masculinity is shaped by various sociocultural factors. This is stated in the following quote: Boehnen divides the factors that shape masculinity into 10 key factors, which are historical location, age and physique, sexual orientation, education, status and lifestyle, geographical location, ethnicity, religion and beliefs, class and occupation, and culture and subculture." This very much aligns with Stirner's claim that spooks are socially maintained ideas rather than natural truths. The next key argument is that masculinity is actually reinforced through social expectation. So the author uses Stirner's discussion of family to show how masculinity is imposed beyond just physical enforcement. So it's not just a physical issue. This is stated in the following quote: "Released from dependence as regards the existing family, one is ruled by the spirit of the family." This, again, is a quote by Stirner used to make this point. So the same logic applies to masculinity. This is the argument. So once external enforcement ceases, like punishment for non-masculine behavior, internalized ideals continue to regulate behavior. And this anecdote of the uncle forcefully wiping off the lipstick reflects this. And this is an interesting part of the text, which I'm going to quote. So, "When I was younger, I would visit the paternal side of my family more frequently, as we would have large gatherings for events. At this one gathering, I asked my sister to put some lipstick that she had on me just because I wanted to wear it. One of my uncles saw me a bit later with that lipstick on me and wasn't very happy. He promptly took a napkin and forcefully wiped the makeup from my lips. He has since apologized, but when he did that, there was something in his head, an idea and an impulse that made him react like that. I faced comments and similar treatment for doing more feminine things because I was a boy, doing girl things, quote unquote." This suggests that the author's uncle acted under the influence of a socially ingrained idea of masculinity, which treated it as an unquestionable standard. So the next argument is that masculinity is enforced at different social levels. So this is what's called hegemonic masculinity. So the text incorporates the concept of hegemonic masculinity, which functions at multiple levels. So in the text, the author states, "Connell and Messerschmitt posit 3 levels of hegemonic masculinity existing at any given time: local, regional, and global." And the author explains that these levels ensure that masculinity remains pervasive and adaptable to different contexts, which further entrenches its ideological power. And the last key argument is that masculinity as a fixed idea governs thought. So this implies that masculinity shouldn't be reformed, but actually entirely abandoned, because it functions primarily as a restrictive ideological force. So the overarching argument is that masculinity isn't an inherent biological reality whatsoever, but actually a social construct that functions as a spook, so an oppressive ideal that dictates behavior. So the personal anecdote in the text serves as an entry point to critique how masculinity is enforced in everyday life, while Stirner and Bainem provide the theoretical foundation for dismantling it. And then the author leaves us with the conclusion, and I'm just going to read you that conclusion. So where does this leave us? Well, as I said at the start, I think we need to do away with masculinity. No matter how we try to twist it, there will always be an unequal dynamic. Masculinity has to exist in opposition to femininity. These social categories seek to tell us who we are and how we need to be who we are. That's what the spook does, crushes the individual. The more we do away with these oppressive structures, the more I believe we'll be able to understand our unique selves. Abulov tells us that, quote, "Essentialist authenticity sees individual and social identities as predetermined wellsprings of expression one needs to tap into. But, quote, existentialism regards identities themselves as manifestations of such creative expressions. You are what you make of yourself, not what you were made of." So I love this essay. It's a really compelling critique of masculinity by combining Max Stirner's philosophy with John Bainen's sociological work, which I haven't encountered anywhere else before. I feel like Onyx effectively demonstrates how masculinity, like other social constructs, operates as a spook that governs individual lives and actions. And I really like the author's use of Bainen's text to contextualize the social construction of masculinity because it grounds it in historical, cultural, and social context. So the essay does a really good job of showing that masculinity is not a natural or inherent trait, but actually a product of societal forces that can be harmful to individuals and communities. And especially the critique of childhood socialization is particularly something that I found really, really important, because it's a very Stirnerian way to make the point by looking at early life experiences and how they solidify masculinity as a spook that people are taught to perform and perceive and prove throughout their lives. So I love it. Read it. I will link it in the description. I have nothing else to say. Friends, I am exhausted. I've been talking for what feels like ever. So I'm going to end it with some important announcements. So please stay tuned for a sec, and then let's meet here again on Sunday. All right, first I would like to let you all know that you can support the project by being a sweet, sweet person and checking the link in the description for all the ways in which to do so. You can be a project assistant and check out the Discord and what all we got going on. You can of course be a financial contributor on the Patreon, YouTube, or Substack, and you can watch and share content that is made by project members, and you can you can purchase our merch if you feel like supporting the project that way and representing a little bit. So please have a look at the description to see all the ways in which you can help. Just click on the link and it will take you there. Then we have another announcement, which is that we have a new discussion board situation in our Discord server, and I would absolutely love it if you went there using the link in the description, which I'm going to share, to discuss the podcast or the e-zine or whatever you're into or want to discuss. And since it's brand new, there's probably not going to be anyone there. You might actually be the first one, but just be patient, give it some time and see if anything develops there. Another thing that I wanted to discuss was the upcoming call for submissions. So as you know from the text that I just shared with you, we have an e-zine, and this e-zine has been established for a little while. We already had many interesting varied submissions. So we have like analyses, we have personal essays, we have opinion pieces, and more that we publish there. We're also open to submissions for that, but this announcement is for something else. So we're now officially looking for submissions for the print zine. There will be an annual print magazine, which will be for sale to support the project. So if you're an artist or a writer and you write about Max Stirner or egoism, then please feel free to submit your work to the print zine. So please check out creative-nothing-zine.com to look into this. I am very much looking forward to your submissions. If you would rather submit to the e-zine, which is published all year round, you can of course do that as well. So just use the submission form on our website. And another announcement, just something that I found interesting recently. There'll be a conference apparently, or like a presentation or something, on June 2nd from 7 to 8:30 p.m. Central European Time. It's free and online. It's called Max Stirner and Hegel on the Struggle for Recognition in Education. I thought you guys might be interested in that. So the talk will be held by Professor Tony Burns, and I will link it in the description. All right, friends, that is all for today. I hope you have a wonderful week, and remember not to let the spooks get you. So see you next Sunday.